Everyone is in, Kwezi. Over to you.
Morning, colleagues, friends, and comrades. My name is Ukwezi Mabasa, and I'm a senior researcher at the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection. And I'm also the co-editor of the book, Beyond Entrepreneurship, Rethinking Black Business and Economic Empowerment, that was published by MISTRA last year in February. And we've engaged in several post-launch activities since then. And this is one of them. And in this particular post-launch activity or webinar, we'll be focusing on the relationship between BE, Black entrepreneurship, and public procurement specifically, drawing on both the book's recommendations, but the lived experiences of the panelists, which include authors of the book, but also several entrepreneurs. I'll just like to start off with a few housekeeping rules or guidelines. We'll just request that colleagues please switch off their mics and their cameras when they're not on the floor. We also are recording the event, so we'd just like to make that transparent that we're recording the event, and it is also linked to our Facebook pages and other YouTube links for those who are wary of the recording context of this particular webinar. So without wasting any more time, I would like to hand over to our Director of Operations, Dr. Abba Omar, who will just welcome everyone. And then I will then take over from him, outlining how the program will unfold, and then initiating our discussion for the day. Thanks. Dr. Abba Omar.
Thank you, Kwezi. Colleagues, comrades, and friends of MISTRA, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the MISTRA Executive Director, Joel Nchitenze, to this webinar on public sector procurement and Black economic empowerment. As Kwezi has mentioned, the spotlight is going to be on local government particularly. But as most of you would know, that this is a follow-up to the Beyond Entrepreneurship book we released last year, co-edited by Ayabonga Tawe and Kwezi Mabasa. This book certainly lifted the bar on thinking around Black business and economic empowerment. Our starting point is that the deep transformation required to overcome the legacy of apartheid era had to place broad-based Black economic empowerment at its center. And this book continuously makes that point. The book takes a frank and unflinching look at terms like tenderpreneurship, which I think most of you know is a very South African term. Even the spell check has to be trained to recognize that word. But a key part of the book and our consideration is procurement in the public sector, which because of a greedy few gets a bad image. And I think we need to go beyond that image and address the real issues around how public procurement can play a role in ensuring that we improve Black economic empowerment. We must address the obstacles we are facing, quite frankly, and we must also look at the kind of ways that we can use to take forward our broad agenda of deracializing of the South African economy. Today's panelists, as Kwezi has mentioned, two panels consist of practitioners in the field, business people, researchers, those in government. We don't believe that there is any such thing as objective research. We believe that research must have a purpose. And I think the book represents that idea, that we should always ensure that the research that we carry out is helping us achieve some purpose. And in this case, it is ensuring that the economy becomes broad-based, that the economy is inclusive of all South Africans, and our economy works in the interest of all South Africans. It gives me great pleasure to now hand over to my colleague and the ever effervescent, probing Kwezi Mabasa. Thank you very much. May you have really good discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abba. We'd just like to remind colleagues about switching off their cameras and also switching off their mics when they're not speaking, so that we can prevent the feedback. In the first session of the webinar, I will just make some brief comments around scene setting. And then we have two other panelists in this particular session. We have Mr. Ayabong Atawe and Umam Judy Nwakedi. So before getting into my scene setting remarks, I would just like to give you a brief background about the two panelists that will be involved in the first part of the program. Ayabong Atawe is a Joburg-based development economist, columnist, radio presenter, photographer, and activist. He is a managing director of Kasibe Holdings, a platform involved in advisory, facilitation, and content development across a wide range of fields. He hosts the Metro FM Talk on Metro FM and writes a regular column for the Daily Maverick and the Business Day. His new book, The Economy on Your Doorstep, Why the South African Economy Misfires and What We Can Do About It, will be published in 2021. Congratulations, Aya. The second panelist is Umam Judy Nwakedi, and she is the Secretary General of the Black Business Council and chairs the Women's Alliance of the BBC. Currently, she is the COO at Tourvest, a global leader in integrated tourism space and a footprint in India, the US, Europe, New Zealand, and across Africa. Prior to her C-suite positions, covered the infrastructure space, energy, and also the global nuclear energy French SOE. She also has a telecoms and broadcasting background. She leads with authenticity and integrity. So those are my two fellow panelists for this first session of our webinar today. So we've already highlighted in the introductory remarks that MISTRA published a book in February 2020 entitled Beyond Entrepreneurship, Rethinking Black Business and Economic Empowerment. And in this book, we primarily aim to address two questions. What is the socio-economic impact of BEE? And then secondly, what are the varied experiences of Black entrepreneurs, even those who have not necessarily been part of major empowerment deals? Since the launch of the book, we've engaged in several post-launch activities, which includes, amongst others, submitting our comments as MISTRA and the authors on the Treasury's procurement bill, which was published for public comment last year in June. We've also collaborated with other organizations, such as the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, on taking forward some of the book's recommendations and exploring areas that need further research. And we've also initiated public policy interventions and debates through op-eds and this webinar as a way of informing the policy discourse. So in all these post-launch activities, we've tried to strike a good balance between policy-based research or evidence policy-based research and also the lived experiences of different or varied entrepreneurs. And this is important because we think that something that is missed in the BE debate are these varied experiences, because there's a monolithic understanding of Black business that does not capture some of the differences and the nuances amongst Black entrepreneurs. The other important thing to say about the context of this webinar and also the recommendations emanating from the book is that all of us can agree that triple BEE and public procurement are suffering a legitimacy crisis, both from the poor performance of transformation in the past years, but as we also know, there are recent criticisms and even court cases that have been actioned that are all aimed at basically arguing that we should scrap triple BEE and even the triple PFA and just implement other different measures. So we're trying to enter this debate in light of these all contextual factors that I've highlighted, but again with primarily a view of providing an evidence-based discussion and a policy debate with the view of shaping the future of public procurement. So obviously there are a lot of recommendations in the book and in our policy briefs, but in this particular seminar or webinar, we're focusing specifically on the relationship between BEE, Black enterprise development, and public procurement. And I think just to set the scene, what I want to do is just highlight the 4 high-level arguments in the book, and then just state how they then inform our submission on how to rethink public procurement. And these 4 high-level arguments are based on the various chapters in the book, but specifically the ones that focus on the relationship between Black business, BEE, and restructuring the political economy. So the first main arguments or recommendations that come from the book is that we argue that it is important to create a conducive macroeconomic environment that achieves the wider socio-economic impacts in BEE policy implementation. And this is because all the evidence suggests that fiscal, monetary competition and industrial policy frameworks shape the success of BEE transactions. So in other words, when we think about debates around these key policy areas, we've got to analyze or assess the impact that they're going to have on triple BEE, both in terms of transactions, but also just state procurement as well. And there are different examples that one can cite to justify this argument. So one of these examples is that we know that most empowerment transactions are financed through third-party debts, and the costs of servicing these loans are determined by monetary policy. So monetary policy definitely matters for the successes and the failures of BEE transactions. Similarly, we know that competition policy and market access also determine pricing debates when it comes to Black entrepreneurs. And when most people discuss pricing, they normally focus on just the fact that Black entrepreneurs can't provide competitive pricing. But they forget that pricing itself is a product of market access. The second major argument that we present in the book is that it's important that we broaden our understanding of Black enterprise development and market transformation. The current focus is on JSE listed companies, which makes sense because the JSE is essential to in our economy. But we argue in the book that we need to look within and beyond the JSE, because most Black enterprises fall within the SMME classification, and they operate in the non-listed space. So in other words, when we think about BEE and economic transformation, we also have to look at non-listed companies and the barriers that exist outside the listed space. The third point that we also make from the book, which is important for framing our discussion today, is that when we think about triple BEE, we must also think about moving beyond the current structure of the economy, which we know has been characterized as the finance-led minerals and energy complex. Most BEE transactions of the past have taken place in mining, finance, and energy, and traditional mining, finance, and energy. And so the question has been raised around the role of BEE in actually diversifying the structural base of South Africa. And what we do in the book is point to specific sectors where we can test this thesis, particularly renewables, and also the digitized platform economies that are developing around the service sectors. The last point that we emphasize in the book is around deal design, financing frameworks, and the performance indicators that need to be reformulated when reconstructing BEE. This is essential for attaining broad-based participation and restructuring of the economy. And what we basically argue is that empowerment transactions must be structured on the basis of and in response to operational and business productivity concerns, and that these two elements should be prioritized over narrow financial indicators, such as share price movements, interest rates, and dividend policies. So those are the four main thrusts or main arguments that we present in the BE publication. And these main arguments, of course, were also used when we made several comments on the public procurement bill that was issued by Treasury. And so they are the framework that hold together our work and the way we engage with public policy discourse and also processes. So I won't go into MISTRA's public procurement submission. We will share that after the webinar, and also because there are two authors in this webinar who played a key role in that submission, who will then share their ideas with us. And the first author is, of course, Ayabonga Kawe, whom I've already introduced. Aya, the floor is yours. You only have 15 minutes. Thanks.
Sure, thanks, Kwezi. And once again, good morning to colleagues, friends, and comrades. I think Kwezi has covered really a lot of the macro debates around our book, and of course, not only just around deal design, but also the market structure questions and the macroeconomic questions that influence outcomes as it relates to broad-based Black economic empowerment. So what I want to maybe touch on, emerging from the book, and I think subsequent discussions that have happened, relates to some of the microeconomic questions at a very local level in relation to procurement, and of course how procurement can be earmarked as a strategy within which to be able to achieve certain objectives. I think the first point to make, and the few points that I want to make with the 15 minutes that I have, is that our publication advocated for a broad-based Black economic empowerment strategy, which took into account the differences within Black enterprise. And when we talk about differences, because I think often the discussion is that of Black business as this monolithic group that is predatory, rather than really looking in a nuanced way at differences in access to capital, access to markets, firm size, as well as the nature of procurement relations and sector-specific opportunities that are all influenced by the choices Black businesses make about where it is that they want to operate. I think the second element, of course, is also that procurement is not just about getting goods and services for the government. It also has the possibility, done in a right framework, to resolve questions of innovation, access to markets, scale, production, and employment. And we argue in our book that policymakers need to align BBBE to structural transformation imperatives. Now, that might seem very broad, amorphous, and very airy-fairy, but the example of this is in the renewable sector, which is a critical part of our energy transition at the moment. It's a sector that is still in very early stages of its product and innovation lifecycle. And it does offer some market opportunities for Black industrialists. And the big questions we need to be asking is, are we doing enough in how we procure renewable energy to facilitate the space for Black industrialists upstream and downstream in the sector? Let me give you a very sort of typical example. In my home province of the Eastern Cape, which I would suggest is the home of South African wind investments in the renewable space, you see wind farms dotted all over the place, right through from Montino, Stekstrom, right through to Wesley, on the Sunshine Coast, and even around Muga. And we saw in the latest debates around the car power ships as well, that a lot of that investment is effectively even in different technology outside of wind, going to parts of the Eastern Cape. Yet the big question mark is, do we have any factories that manufacture, repair, or provide the components for some of the wind turbines that we have? And the answer in many instances is no. You'll find if you go to Muga, that there's DCD wind towers, which is there, and a factory that closed effectively a few years ago. And I think if there are any colleagues from the IDC, they might be able to explain what some of the issues have been around that. So I think these are the questions that our book is really trying to encourage not only just policymakers, but the society to start to interrogate. We also feel that within this framework, there's a very strong role for state-owned entities. Just on the basis of their market position in key network industries in the South African economy, the scale, the sunk investments that they have, and the upstream and the downstream linkages that they have in critical sectors of the economy. But if we are to leverage that, we need to ensure that we make the necessary early stage investments in enterprise development, in risk sharing, ensuring that people are able to access finance on a better basis from a cost of capital perspective than what they'd be able to go and find if they went to the commercial banks. We don't have that. I think the other element, and it's coming up quite strongly in South Africa's call alongside India for IP waivers on vaccines in the COVID moment, is this question of research and development, IP, intellectual property and patent development that is emerging from our national system of innovation. And how do we make sure that we use procurement to ensure that that kind of innovation that's coming from our national system of innovation, our universities, our design centers, CSIR, MinTech, and all of those areas, is aligned to some of our industrial objectives. And I think there's often this misalignment and a lack of coherence or incoherence in that regard. I mean, an example of this is the lithium battery industry. Now, a lot of South Africans might not know that South Africa was probably one of the pathfinders and pioneers in research into lithium battery technology. Yet in 1992, the CSIR decided to pack up that program. And fast forward about 3 years or so, around 95, lithium batteries and the technology that had emerged from our national system of innovation became a critical part of the electronics boom in the 1990s in the United States. Now, we've lost out on that. And we also see now that the lithium battery industry is probably at the frontier of some of the auto electric surges that we see and the debates around electric cars that are happening. We have the platinum, we had the intellectual property and the research capability and the institutions to do some of this pathfinding work. And yet there isn't a discussion at the moment around how do we use those two comparative and competitive advantages to be able to really industrialize our economy on a different basis, broaden economic participation beyond just the selected few. I think the other element, and Kwesi touched on some of this, is around state rents, incentives, which need to be used in a very clear mechanism. And of course, procurement is one such rent. We need to be clear about how we use it. And of course, the expectations that we have of some of the people that benefit from procurement. I mean, one of the criticisms, certainly that, and even in a recent op-ed that Kwesi and I put together, that we've made is this idea of the illusion of price discovery in our procurement system. So our procurement system, yes, rightfully so, prioritizes cost considerations because we want to get value for money. But inadvertently, how we design our procurement system ends up leading to a lot of leakage. And I make the example, of course, of two areas in the Eastern Cape, OR Tambo District Municipality and Alfred Nzo, which every year have to invest in backlog eradication programs linked to water and sanitation. Yet it seems every single time that there's a procurement of toilets in different wards in these two districts, there's a seeming process of price discovery, as if the previous year we had not had interactions with the marketplace enough for our procurement system to build the market intelligence, but to also have a programmatic, multi-year and even multi-decade system that deals with this challenge of backlog eradication. In my view, there would be potential cost savings in such a procurement framework, because you would leverage the bargaining position of government as a major, buyer or monopsony buyer of some of these, ventilated, improved pit toilets, or even, some of the components that go into a sanitation and water reticulation infrastructure. But effectively, we don't do that, because what we do is that we parcel out these projects in very small, contracts that effectively incentivize more costly engagements for compliance purposes. And if you think about the price and scale considerations, what effectively you end up have happening is import leakage, the use of labor displacing technology to minimize costs on projects and to maximize the margins that people are able to get. And effectively, you end up losing on some of those multiplier impacts in terms of expanded production, boosting the productive base, and effectively also expanding employment. And I think these are the debates we need to be having as we think about reviewing our procurement system to align it with the broader imperatives of empowerment that go beyond just questions of ownership and managerial control, but speak to the primary challenges that we're facing in this country, which is one, getting more and more people into work, but also two, ensuring that we continue to stem the deindustrialization that we continue to see in our society. Maybe the last point I want to make, and I guess it relates to something, and Kwesi touched on the upcoming book, and one of the elements that is engaged in that particular book is this idea of being able to think about procurement in wider terms. I spoke about the renewable sector, and we can have debates around water, sanitation, and key service-related capital spending. But I think the other element where our procurement needs to really be targeting is the 18.1 million or so SASSA grants that we pay out every month. It cannot be correct that effectively that underwrites and gives predictable and very frequent cash flows to the mainstream food retail system at a time when many land reform beneficiaries are saying they don't have access to the market. At a time where many women cooperatives and even women's groups in the food production and textile production space are saying we don't have access to even the schools markets, or even the markets for prisons, or even the markets for our hospitals, let alone the market of people who queue up every day to come and collect their social transfers. And of course, the debate has to really shift towards saying, how do you ensure that we're able to stem this oligopolistic control of the mainstream food system on even some of those social transfers as well? And one of the things that I propose in that regard is a cashless voucher component that is added to the grant, where effectively you're able to aggregate the produce that comes from land reform beneficiaries and any other productive units in the economy, and aggregate that and be able to sell that in a cashless voucher framework, effectively opening up that particular market to some of these producers that are beneficiaries of state support and state procurement, but also in so doing, really starting to gather the insights that you need for a comprehensive social security and social protection framework. And at the center of that, of course, is this idea of either a basic income grant or even a basic asset grant. So I want to pause there and once again, thank the team at MISTRA, Comrade Abba and Comrade Kwezi for the great work, I guess, in putting this book together. And I think may the discussions long continue as we try and really review, iterate, and fine-tune our procurement system in a manner that is able to respond to the challenges that we face. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ayabonga, for that succinct presentation, and also raising some pertinent political economy issues that we've highlighted in the book. The issue of value chains and its relation to local content designation. I hope colleagues of the IDC are here. The second issue that I think is important is also the relationship between BE, Black enterprise, and new markets, particularly looking at renewable energy and PGMs. I'll now hand over to Usis Judy Nokedi from the Black Business Council, who will also share her extensive experiences. Sis Judy, over to you.
Thank you, and a very good morning to everyone who has joined us today in terms of a very, very important topic. In fact, it is probably the backbone of what the Black Business Council does. So allow me to offer some introductory comments, and then I'll dive into some of the experiences of the Black Business Council. Now, whilst today we're talking about public procurement, the first comment I want to make is the internecine relationship between public and private in the South African economic landscape. That when you begin to flesh out public procurement, you run into a danger of the ecosystem of supply chain, global value chains, and how you actually, let's say, build a bridge or build a school. So that's the first comment I want to make. The second comment I want to make, and I'll flesh this out a little bit more, is that the Auditor General's current report talks to the endemic and the systemic breakdown of service delivery. And if you don't have service provision, you can't have service delivery. And that talks to the essence of tenderpreneurship. And so when you review the Auditor General's reports, you can see the complexity which we have created that we deal with. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about a capable and competent state. Now, at the Black Business Council, and in terms of organized structures in civil society, if we do not support and if government does not fund organizations like ours, the Black Business Council, NAFCOC, and other such organizations, you also limit the potential that this important sector provides in terms of building an inclusive and a participatory economy. I'm going to focus on two key sectors, which for us as the Business Council is critical, and that is the financial services sector. And that is not just banks. We're talking about banks, because once you have a business, you have to risk-proof your business, so you need insurance. And then in terms of traditional sources of funding, I want to talk about the Black securities and investment sector as well, because these are the sectors where you see if Black people are not making the decisions, then those who come to these institutions to access the facilities and the instruments around financing and debt, you begin to see this imbalance. And then I want to talk a little bit about the pharmaceutical industry. The previous speaker spoke about energy. Now, I come from the nuclear industry, and I'm not going to speak about that today, but when you dive deep into the nuclear industry and you see how Black business has locked out and blocked out of participating in such a crucial industry, put aside all our misgivings around nuclear energy. The nuclear industry, of which again South Africa leads the world when it comes to isotope production. No country in the world can do what we do when it comes to isotopes. We ship 48 hours a day around the world. We actually not ship, we move isotopes, because there is nothing you can do in today's economy without an isotope, whether it's agriculture, whether it's medicine, whether it's telecoms. More about that later. But I want to talk about the pharmaceutical industry, because this provided us as a country in the midst of the COVID pandemic to once and forever change the way in which we do business. And I have to say that our government at every level failed us. And I'm going to talk about BBC's role in business for South Africa, and how, even though we were at the table, we were not welcome at the table. More about that later. So I want to talk about tenderpreneurship. I find it very difficult to pronounce this word. I don't know about those of all of us where English is not our first language. And I want to look at the T, because the reality is, it is not entrepreneurship in the tender space that is fundamentally problematic. It is the thieves, the thugs, and the tsotsis. This is where the problem, that is, when you talk about a virus, that is the virus. So for many of us who are Black and in business, if you exist to do business with the state only, you can never grow your business. You'll be forever trapped and locked into that ecosystem. And so for many of the Black business people who, yes, that is how you get your foot in the door. This is how you get involved in supply chain between the public and the private. The single biggest barrier is access to capital. And that is why we need to look at the financial services sector. And it's quite interesting that we are here today on this webinar, and the Banking Association has launched, they've released their document, which I've not had a chance to look at yet, around the state of transformation in that sector. I'm not going to go into the origin of the first business organization which was established by Black traders in Soweto, NAFCOC, because from NAFCOC, you led to the creation of BUSA, and out of BUSA, when Black business walked out of BUSA, the Black Business Council was formed. Incidentally, we often say that, we've just signed an agreement with the oldest Black business organization in America. It's 120 years old. So you have to develop instruments and institutions that withstand the test of time and the vagaries of problems. So we are hoping that the Black Business Council will continue until the day that business in this country reflects the demographics of who this country is, that those who own and those who manage and those who distribute resources that are a direct result of a tax-paying universe that is the day the Black Business Council then can say it is our job, and it is our job that is done. So if you look at some of the problems that we as the Black Business Council face when it comes to public procurement at every level, national, provincial, and municipal, it is the corrosive practices that is enacted by the state, cadre deployment, and unmerited appointments that leads to this problem. Now, we believe as the Black Business Council that BBEE and meritocracy can exist alongside each other. The biggest enemy is not the instrument, but it is those that have to implement and execute a dividend at the end of that instrument making opportunities available. And then when it comes to at a local level, and we as Black business, as the Black Business Council, when it comes to the Black woman engaging at a local level across sectors, we have to deal with an additional issue other than the payment, that from the time you walk into the building, you've got to pay the secretary, you've got to pay the receptionist, you've got to pay all the way up the value chain, which adds to the cost that you finally peg when you submit that tender. We then as women have to confront with sex in exchange for a deal, physical abuse, harassment, and in some instances, even death. Now, when you look at the financial services sector, a 200 billion rand loan scheme, guarantee scheme was introduced in a way conceptualized by the big banks. But when you look at who benefited from that loan guarantee scheme, at the moment, the numbers are being calibrated to see what percentage of Black business actually enjoyed access to a very attractive financial instrument that was made available. A week ago, we as the Black Business Council held a meeting with the leading bank. Allow me to not name the bank, but I think you will all know which bank I'm talking about. The bank parted ways with the CEO. They claimed in their public statement that there was a cultural misalignment, a strategic misalignment, and we also then learned that there was an operational model, a problem. What was very interesting about that meeting, and you often find this, that every time we as the Black Business Council engage with a private sector, a major player in the economy, the person, whoever heads that board, rolls into the room Black board members, as if we are there, Blacks to talk with Blacks. And we find that problematic. So that was the most recent incident that we have now engaged with to find out what is going on in the financial services. A month before that, we had a very similar meeting with another major bank where that CEO, the first Black female CEO, again parted ways. Casualties, they become the casualties of a bigger issue. Peter Moyer was another casualty, yet the boards remain intact. So we believe that part of the problem that we have here is an untransformed banking services sector. At the moment, you only have one Black CEO in the insurance. Try, as a Black business player, to get an insurance claim paid out. You need to prove your innocence way and beyond the confinement and the contractual agreement. Then when you come to the securities industry, bigger problems there. Assets and the state-owned assets are not being managed by Black asset managers. And this is the universe that allows you to play and to do business fairly and squarely. Now, allow me to pause just for a moment on the pharmaceutical industry. When COVID hit us, and it hit us badly, it decimated and annihilated sectors. However, there were other sectors that had recorded record growth numbers. And at the height of the at the height of COVID, the crisis around COVID, when the PPE, the funding and the Solidarity Fund was established to fund the procurement of personal protective equipment, it was the biggest fight that we have in recent times had to deal with. And the fight is still not over, because we've called for a forensic investigation into who got the money. Where did the money come from? So you find, so all along, Business for South Africa was formed between BUSA and Black Business Council. However, we have had to fight tooth and nail with our white counterparts in BUSA to say, there has to be an equality here, equal representation, equal decision-making. We are still in the fight. We are not winning the fight, because when you look to the single biggest contract around logistics, the movement of the vaccines, and you look at who won that tender, it is established white business. So you ask yourself today, government, the role of government in terms of public procurement, why is it that we are fighting? We may get to first base, then we go back to home base. I feel very passionately about the COVID and the opportunities that COVID presented, because we always say, what are the nascent industries? What are the greenfield industries? So that you don't have to deal with legacy issues, and you just have our Black elected government, our Black officials who can say, this is a new industry. We were screwed over in the renewable space, because they kept saying you want people with skin in the game, people who have experience. Yet there was very little experience with the global players that came into this country. They learned by our experience. So when it came to COVID, now the vaccine issue, you have a Black company in Cape Town. The CEO is Black, the chairman is Black, the scientists are Black. They are world class. They lead in their industries. However, the financing of the COVID vaccine did not come to Black players. From day one, as the BBC, we have fought with government to say, why are you not funding the Black scientists, the Black innovators? We are now months into the COVID vaccine rollout. We have found traction with government to say they will now fund us. So, here we are. It's not only the vaccine, it is the supply chain around the vaccine. We wanted funding for our Black businesses who manufacture needles, syringes, swabs, etc. We're not there yet. So as my time grows to an end, I want to talk about some of the barriers that we find, whether it's established Black business. If you're a startup Black business and you're an innovator, you will not get private equity funding. You will not even smell venture capital funding. So we believe that whole space in the financial services has to be re-engineered, from established financing instruments to VC. We need to up the ante when it comes to venture capital, because for a young and an old innovator, age, when it comes to innovation, it is not the purvey of young people. Many Black scientists have sat with innovation, scientists my age, where we've tried to get a venture capital to roll out our projects. So that's the first step. You can't get access to money. Then it's the licenses, the permits, the rights, the environmental impact studies, all of these studies that have to be done, that again just cuts you off before you can play in the game. So, colleagues, that Black people were prevented from playing their part in business, not because they were not offered access to capital, but because they were prevented by law. So anyone who wants to challenge BEE, bring them to me so that we can make it very clear to them that BEE is not the problem. We were prevented by law, we were prevented to become members of pension funds, and we were made perpetual beggars, and we are still beggars that we need to change. So a reflection as I draw to an end. Slavery ended more than 100 years ago, according to research done in America. They say it would take up to 228 years for Black families to accumulate the same amount of wealth now compared to white families. If we did that study amongst Blacks in South Africa who still do not have access to the land, how many years is it going to take us to equal that playing field? And we've got to get there quicker and faster, because my children and my grandchildren, that of Dr. Abba Omar, we don't have time to wait. We have to fix it for our children. So what next from us as the BBC, as we just celebrated our Freedom Day on the 27th of April and May Day on the 1st of May? How do we ensure that the lives of ordinary South Africans are going to be fundamentally changed so that the economy is inclusive and participatory? At the BBC, we want a serious look at trusts. White people have had the benefit of trusts since the day they took our land, and now they are digging deep to change the creation and the structure of trust, because we as Blacks want to establish trust. We have an issue there, and we're working on it. The BBBE Advisory Council, because the leadership there, that council has to be announced so that they can do their work. Some of the charters that are not there, we want those charters reviewed. Localization, and global value chains has to be relooked, and equity equivalence. And then, of course, the big game changer for us on the continent right now is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So those are some of the insights from us as the Black Business Council. The baby and the bathwater cannot be thrown out. The baby, our baby, Black economic empowerment is still a baby. And the grime and the crime is the bathwater. Do not throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I welcome this book. I also think to the Mapungube team and the MISTRA team, we actually need some serious study groups. We need to take each chapter in the book. And for those of us who are not researchers and academics, have a course. It can last, an online course for about 2 months, where we can do online digging deep with each of the authors of those books to understand from a business perspective what your learnings are, so that we can understand the absolute genius in what is contained within the pages of those books, of your book. And we need to act now. And as I conclude, from a Black business point of view, we have said that gender-based policy, procurement, and budgeting, which we led at the dawn of democracy and we dropped it, that we want a minimum of 40% set aside, absolutely set aside, on panels, adjudication panels, tender committees, whatever it is, 40% representation on every panel, 40% representation on every board and every committee, and 40% procurement set aside for the Black woman, because we have learned that the Black woman is probably even more marginalized in the whole of this economy. And we say at the Black Business Council, Women's Council, Sekuma Wenze, do it, just do it. No excuses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sis Judy, for that strong and powerful presentation. And I think you also raised some pertinent issues that we need to debate in the discussion session. The political economy of finance, both in terms of looking at the banking sector, but also broader companies within finance itself, raising issues around intersectionality and the gender question when thinking about transforming the political economy and not just looking at race and class. And then also important issues around the capable state, or what is referred to as the developmental state. So some colleagues have already started posing questions in the chat. I will then pose these questions to Sis Judy and Ayabonga. But while I'm posing these questions, colleagues, feel free to indicate either via the hand signal or via just dropping your name in the chat if you want to add an additional question. So I think for the first round, we'll just take the questions that were posed in the chat while the presenters were presenting. I will just direct them to both presenters. The first question is around the debates for you, Ayabonga, around competitive pricing and Section 217 of the Constitution in the PPPFA. And how do we get around that? Because that preferential procurement issue is an impediment in light of the argument that the book makes and that you've alluded to around the relationship between market access and actually pricing. The second question for you is also around this debate of thinking about BEE and Black entrepreneurship in the new sectors. on new product markets, particularly renewable energy, and you alluded to the platinum group value chains. What other interventions do we need to really tap that innovation and amplify that link between BE and new sectors? So those would be your two questions. And then to Sis Judy, I think the first question for you would be around this debate around the capable states, particularly the local state, because that's where most Black SMMEs also interface with these business contexts and environment challenges that you alluded to. So how do we improve that? And I think I'd also like to hear your comments on how do you also improve the local state's capability to just have a basic understanding and market intelligence of businesses in the different municipalities. The second question has to do with skills. We often hear in political economy debates that certain players argue that they have the capital, they have the support, but the issue is that the targeted beneficiaries don't have the skills. So one then would like to hear your opinion and your views around how do we get around the skills debate. Because I don't see any further questions here on the finance sector, but I'm gonna use my privilege as the chair. But around the finance sector and this debate around Black business, what's your view on some of the risk measures that are used when issuing out loans to Black businesses within the finance sector? And what role do you think state DFIs can play in trying to alleviate that particular challenge? So I think maybe you guys can address those questions that are emanating from the chat. And if anyone else has a question, feel free to just write your name in the chat and I'll take it. Otherwise, we'll take the break before the next session. Thanks.
Judy, I don't know if you want to go first.
You're the academic and the researcher, but allow me.
Sure.
I'm happy to go first because. But I want to talk about market access and pricing, because when you tender, depending on which principle is used, and as the BBC, we've had serious challenges around all the legislation that governs procurement. And we believe that you must pay for transformation. So let me give you an example. When that aeroplane came with the first flight of vaccines, and we asked the question, I think let me not get the airline wrong, it could have been an Etihad, I can't remember, someone will correct me. It was one of the top airlines, and the question was by us, why was SAA not used? And the argument out of the quarters from Business for South Africa was because of the cost. And we said that in order to drive the change, your transformation costs, and you need to finance the cost. In business, because when you do R&D, that's where you're pumping your money into. And that's the problem with the pharmaceutical industry. You want to recoup your cost before you price the drug. And that is one of our biggest problems and why we can't access drugs internationally. So you need to factor in, if you are serious about transformation, what latitude will you provide in order for, it can't only be on the basis of cost, because with big multinationals and big business, you can build your cost in elsewhere. You can say, if I have 5 divisions or 5 subdivisions in my business, that division will finance that cost overrun. So there are many ways in which you slice the onion here in business. So it cannot only be about pricing. And that's a big issue for us. Around the capable state and the local state, I mean, if you look at the slew of graduates that have come out in the last 20 years, the skill sets are there. I used to procure, when I would headhunt in my telecommunications day and in my nuclear day, I would go to the state-owned entities, look for the brightest engineer or software developer, whatever the skill set, project manager. And I would then take say a telecom engineer or an ESCOM engineer with an engineer that's come straight from a multinational. And you have two different creatures. They come from Googs, or they come from Khayelitsha, or they come where I come from, which is Galvindale and the Cape Flats. Same backgrounds, same families, same educational developmental path, same university. And then you rock up in the space of work and you ask these young people, why is, what's going on here? The one works a different, and it comes down to culture and ethics. So at a local level, I do believe we can, why does everyone leave the Eastern Cape? My parents left the Eastern Cape. I've left the Eastern Cape because there are no opportunities. Why do we have to leave? The work is there, but you don't get your foot in the door. So the whole way in which we recruit and we employ in the local government sector, in local government, that needs a fundamental overhaul. Outsource it, get people to do it. Because at the moment, you pay for the job, you sleep for the job, you do whatever you have for the job, and it's not based on skill and experience. Skills, in certain areas, there are skill set shortages, but in other areas, no. Our top skill sets leave the country. Case in point, I worked for the biggest state-owned entity that operated as a commercial business in the nuclear space. Areva in France, worked all over the world, came back to South Africa, couldn't get a job. No one wants to hire you. We find that accountants, lawyers, engineers, they work for Accenture, they work for PwC, they work for the big law firms, they start their own practices, they don't get work. Somehow, that brand that comes with some equity that starts with a W is seen as more attractive than you with a surname that starts with an N. So you are protected in terms of your experience and your expertise when you work in these companies that have brand equity. When you go out on your own cadres in government will not support you and will not hire you. And that's the problem around skills. Risk and loan, if you don't pay back the money, there is a consequence, but blacks pay back their loans. In a nutshell.
Okay, thanks.
Especially black women.
Okay, thanks, Manpreet, for those answers. Aya, over to you.
Yeah, I think Comrade Judy's covered a lot of what I wanted to say, just around some of the skill questions, because I do think that there's major concerns there, and skills development is a critical part of triple BE, and yet we seldom sort of unpack the details of what kind of skills are we giving to people and whether or not those are responding to new areas of market opportunity. And I think that's something that we seldom talk about. There's three questions that were directed to me. The one is around Section 27 and how we deal with 217 of the Constitution and how we deal with the price and scale issue. And I think, for me, that issue is resolved even within that section of the Constitution, because 2A of that section allows for categories of preference, but also Section 3, or I should say subsection 3 of Section 217 of the Constitution also effectively gives some discretion to the executive to effectively create regulations that give effect to those categories of preference. And so the triple PFA in effect emerges out of that particular injunction. But I think for me, the big issue when it comes to pricing, and this is why I argue that if you were doing more longer term programmatic procurement, you would not only incentivize people to invest in industrial upgrade, in improvements in productivity, in expansions of production and employment, but you would also be effectively using the bargaining position of the state as a large monopsony buyer, so a large dominant buyer of toilets, of water, pipes for the reticulation of water from treatment plants to the home, and all manner of other things that effectively allow you to realize cost savings. But the problem is that the medium-term expenditure framework, which only allows for a 3-year cycle of planning, is primarily incompatible with the kind of time horizon that's required for industrialists to make decisions. So if, for instance, you come to me from the Chris Hani District Municipality and you say, look, Aya, we want to incentivize you to go and build a factory at one of the old industrial parks, but we are going to say to you and another competitor, come into some form of horizontal agreement. We'll sign that off for the competition authorities, but we want you to invest in your plant so that you're able to assist us in dealing with backlog eradication and build all the toilets we need from Craddock right through to Nom. Now, that's not possible for me as an industrialist if I'm in that situation, if I only have line of sight over what those allocations are going to be, or what, how do I put this, what support or incentives are going to be on offer for me only for 3 years. Because nobody makes decisions in industrial terms on just a 3-year cycle. Nobody does that. And I think the issue for us is that the regulations we have created in the procurement space effectively don't make space for the kind of long, patient contributions. Because what we're saying here is that use procurement spend as seed capital for Black industrialists to effectively meet the needs that are in the service, authority, and functions of many district and local municipalities. I think the second issue is around the new industries. Yes, I've mentioned renewables. The other, of course, is the platinum group metals related battery sector, which is going to feed into the auto electric industry. But also, I think the other element is the ICT and digital value chains. I'm involved with a team in operating a series of Wi-Fi public hotspots in the Eastern Cape. It's the biggest headache of our lives, because effectively what has happened, the failure of the local state to provide underlying infrastructure beyond just edge, even just at the level of 3G in that area, has effectively created a disincentive for Black ISPs to invest in that space. Because effectively your hardware choices are going to be some of the most expensive in the marketplace, because the underlying fiber and connectivity infrastructure is not there. And I think we need to think about this. How do we use procurement, even of things that we're going to need in the future, making sure that connectivity infrastructure gets into our townships as something to crowd in the private sector, and in particular, African and in general, Black industrialists into our townships effectively to improve the kind of businesses and to also widen and diversify the kind of economic opportunities that are on offer. Maybe the last comment, and I think it's a comment around financing. And I think there's a big debate, around why does the Land Bank, for instance, not give us concessional funding if we're working in the agri space? Why does the IDC give people, a funding on rates that are comparable to what you would get at a commercial bank? When the issue is, we need to ask, where do our DFIs get their money? And we know, if you take, for instance, the NEF, they haven't been capitalized in nearly 10 years. So the big question is, where do we think they're getting the money to on-lend to us as entrepreneurs? So there's question marks around that. And I think the DBSA has probably been one of the entities, I think the CEO came out last year, in one discussion within the presidency, saying the big concern is that the DFIs are competing with the commercial banks in the wholesale financing market. So where they go and borrow the money in those capital markets to on-lend effectively is not occurring on concessional terms. So the issue is that it's quite difficult for them to provide concessional financing to Black industrialists if they themselves are not getting a funding on a favorable cost of capital basis. And I think this is where the debate around the central bank becomes important. Not just on the question of saying, nationalize it, do this, do that, no, but the implications of having a different use of the instruments at the disposal of the central bank. And I'm not only talking about the interest rate here as the cost of money, but I'm also talking about the balance sheet of the central bank. They put out statements of assets and liabilities every month. How do we use those two instruments in a coherent process to effectively diversify where some of these DFIs are getting their capital? And we did it with the loan guarantee scheme and it failed. But what stops us from doing that for the DFIs so that they can go and effectively on-lend to all of the African and Black industrialists that we have in our economy? And I think that's the issue, that if we're able really to unpack the issues around the value chain of capital, then you are able to unpack and realize, I guess, the unenviable position of many of our DFIs, who have to go into the marketplace and go and borrow on terms not of their own making, but effectively are then expected in the retail leg of the marketplace to loan on concessional terms. And I think then the last issue is that if we're going to operate from a financing perspective in the short-termist mindset, then we're not going to build industrialists. The developmental states in the East Asian experience were able to effectively provide concessional and patient capital over decades. so that you're able, and even here in South Africa, I mean, if you think about some of the SOEs, the Sasols of the world, who had this access to this kind of capital on a longer term basis, not this idea that we're only going to give you capital for 5 years, you must repay it back in 5 years. No. If we really want to create local level champions, industrial champions that respond to the needs of local institutions and authorities, then we're going to have to be able to really reconfigure the capital space and also reconfigure the wholesale capital markets that many of our DFIs go and borrow from. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Thanks, colleagues, for the responses. In light of time constraints, I'm going to quickly pose 2 questions that were raised in the chat, and then allow Eddie to ask his question orally because he put up his hand. But I will ask that colleagues please answer these next 2 questions very succinctly, because we've got to take a 10-minute break and afterwards have the next session of the webinar, which is also going to be very exciting, because then we're going to understand how some of these macroeconomic, political economy issues affect business persons on the ground. So the first question has to do with, and this is to both the speakers, whether a state-owned bank would alleviate the financial challenges encountered by Black entrepreneurs. If yes, what would make a state-owned bank different? The second one is on broadening the base and ensuring that workers and communities benefit from BBB. Our book does allude to some recommendations on how to take this forward. And I was also speaking about the same debate on ESOPs on radio last night, but maybe Aya, you can answer that particular one. And then let's let Eddie ask his question, and then we can close this first session. Eddie? So just answer those 2 questions, colleagues, and then just before you answer, let's let Eddie pose his question. Eddie?
Yeah, thanks. I don't know if you can see me. Anyway, yeah. So here's my question. It's really around the reconciling this contradiction around, the parceling of the contracts that Ayabonga has spoken about, and the scaling issue, especially when you think about implementing, big projects. And I say this also considering what you almost see as the ANC's fixation with the socialization of procurement, where, or for lack of a better word, the sharing economy, where almost you get a feel that for the ANC to have made an impact with public procurement is when a tender has been shared among 100 small entrepreneurs, and mainly those would be Black and small entrepreneurs. But when it comes to white firms, because they've got scale, they're almost allowed to go into business alone. But Black people are almost forced to share the spoils, which are almost being thrown out by the big white-owned firms because they may have scalability abilities which we don't have. So the question is this ideological orientation of the ANC for the sharing economy, which I suppose we almost aspire to share. If we have small, we must all share the pie, but the impeding effect, the hampering effect it has on small firms to grow, because almost they must almost have to rely on these small spoils from the big firms. How then we reconcile those contradictions? That's the question for us.
Thank you very much, Eddie. Colleagues, please answer those questions succinctly so that we can go into our break and then the next session. Thanks. The floor is over to you.
Ayabonga, you go first this time.
Thanks, Judy. Maybe let me start with the last question that Eddie's asking, and I want to marry it to the question that's come from Galaxy S8. I don't know who Galaxy S8 is in the chat, which is around skills development, local economic development, and many local contractors getting away with not training people on projects. And I think it goes back to the point that I'm making. I mean, if these projects are being parceled out in small, pieces all over the place, there's an incentive on the contractor to effectively use labor displacing capital that, one, minimizes their cost base, widens their margins, and effectively you find a situation where people are wearing orange overalls of the EPWP standing alongside a project and doing effectively nothing. But I think the other problem is that we haven't widened the scope of our aperture to think about industrialization as something that can have spillover and positive externalities that effectively create opportunities for some of the small businesses that Eddie was talking about. So in effect, what we do is to think about a certain project and say, if this project is 974 million, our target is to make sure that directly from that 974 million, you have 12 entrepreneurs or SMMEs that benefit from that, rather than effectively taking a value chain approach that says, if we appoint 2 or 3 main contractors, there should be a very strong supply and even factor choice. When I say factor choice, choice between capital and employment considerations that are part of that agreement. But you see, if you're only going to do that agreement for one contract, you then lose the impact of having a multi-year and even multi-decade social contract with certain entities that allow you to scale the kind of economic participation and expansions in the productive base that you're looking for. So I think for me, how you reconcile that contradiction is to think much wider about the economic value that is realized beyond just the seed that state procurement is, but effectively think about the second and third round economic impacts that come from certain market relationships that are not going to happen for themselves. You're going to effectively have to, impose what Kwesi and Alice Amsden call reciprocal control mechanisms. Because if we're saying we're coming into an agreement between a group of suppliers for 15 years, then effectively in that 15 years, we're giving you predictable cash flows, we're de-risking your business. In return, we want you to transform. We want you to improve the skills development and productivity of your workers. And in addition to that, we want you to use local Black and African suppliers. That's what we're looking for. And I think for me, that's something that can be put on the table and we can have that discussion. Maybe just a last comment on this question of broadening the base. I think a lot has been said in the last while about employee share ownership schemes and all of these kinds of programs. I must say, people often talk about the optimism of the will and pessimism of the intellect. I think for me on this one, my intellect is very pessimistic, largely because I don't think ownership alone or changing who sits on a board allows you to resolve what I call the distributional and production decisions within a firm. Let me give you an example. Many people have been calling for worker representation on boards, as an endpoint. And I'm saying that's a means to something. You had Zwelinzi Mavavi, for instance, sitting on the board of the IDC for a very long time. What did that do to change the industrial financing landscape? I don't know. And I think we can have a similar debate about the PIC. For me, the issue is if workers by being represented on the boards and even in the executive committees of these entities are going to skew the questions of distribution. So the decision between buying back your shares, paying out dividends, or reinvesting in the plant so that you can expand production and expand employment. If they are able to skew some of those trade-offs in favor of the economy, in favor of our national objectives, then I certainly support that. And I think that is something that we must support. But we must not see having the ESOP or having the workers on the board as the end game. I don't think that's the end game. The real end game is around being able to determine distributional, operational, and even production decisions in a way that effectively expands production and expands employment. Last comment, I think on the State Bank, I think it's an important discussion. I also think, how the debate has taken on, and many of the comrades in the ANC will maybe attack me for this, but I don't think we've taken into account what financialization has done to our economy. When we talk about a state bank, what kind of bank do we want? Where will this bank raise its wholesale funding and capital? Do we want it to compete with some of the commercial banks? If so, where and how? And I think the other question is around the transaction channels of banking. If you look at all of the main, say, 5 banks, Capitec, African Bank, FNB, Nedbank, Standard Bank, and you look at their district or transaction channels over the last while, there is a shift away from, going into a branch, withdrawing cash. There is a shift away from the use of ATMs. There is a shift towards data-heavy channels. So using the app for security, authentication, because those are the channels that can be monetized for predictive products and effectively to cross-market other products to you. Airtime, electricity, all of the other things that with a USSD code, you can effectively now be able to buy. So the issue now is that banking, to accumulate, no longer needs the tellers who used to sit behind that glass door in an SKL and effectively serve. They don't need that anymore, because the model of banking is shifting to a model of accumulation without labor power in the traditional sense. And I think if we want a state bank, we must be able to confront that. What kind of state bank do we want? For what purpose? If the state bank is around creating a state industrial bank in the mold of what we see in China, we can have that debate. But if you're looking for a transactional retail bank that's going to compete with some of the banks that are now effectively expanding production while doing away with labor, doing away with their branch network, then I think it's a bit more of a complicated factor. But in essence, I do support, I think, the call from an industrial perspective and industrial financing perspective to have much more state intervention in the wholesale funding market and even in the funding market for enterprises. But I think if you're going to try and compete on the transactional banking channels with some of the existing banks, then I think that that's a fool's errand.
Thanks, Aya. Sis Judy?
I'm almost tempted to say ditto, ditto, ditto. What more can I add? I would challenge the notion of boards. Having worked in the corporate sector and boards and shareholders, I think the challenge really is boards accepting the power they have, because change happens at the board level. When the executive team presents the strategy...
Yeah, that's why it was going all the way across. It was covering that.
Sorry,
Shall I continue?
Colleagues, can you please make sure that your mics are switched off? Sorry, Sis Judy.
No problem.
Thanks, colleagues.
So when you have that meeting between your executive team, your board, and your shareholders and your lenders, the board has the power to drive that change. And we see it in the business world, that when boards are not prepared to say, I'm not happy with this budget, I'm not happy with your metrics and your indicators, where boards just churn over year after year and nothing changes. And this is part of the problem that you see in whether it's ShopRite, Checkers, whether it's the Spar Group, the Spur Group, whatever it is, where if you look at the retail, the food sector at the moment, which is so untransformed, you ask yourself, where is the board? Where was the board? So I do believe that change happens at multiple levels, but just a single issue like gender, if the chairman of the board does not say, I want some diversity at this boardroom table, nothing will change. So it starts, often we say it starts at the board. Secondly, in terms of a state bank, I think, yes, the sentiments as expressed by Ayabonga spot on. You could argue that we have a number of state banks already. We have the Land Bank, we have the Post Bank, we have the IDC, we have the African Development Bank, we have the Development Bank of South Africa. What do we want to do with the PIC operates in that space to a degree? So what do you want the state bank to do? We have argued that we want a black bank. And now we have the first female, for those of you who have been following the story, a female black bank. And when you look at banking all over the world, the countries that emerged successfully from the last recession, and I may say post-COVID, are countries where they have female banks, because the culture of the bank and the financing of the bank, that is not just a mindset, it is who you're going to finance, how you're going to finance. So that is where a black bank, allow me to leave the state bank for a moment, but where a black bank and some of the successes we've had in terms of mine workers and the mine work, that bank, UBank, you will see the difference in how those banks operate. I think a digitized environment works for those of us who lives in cities, etc. Let's not forget the people in informal settlements, rural communities, and in the villages. They still rely, and you see them queuing tragically every month for that social security grant. So mobile banking, yes, that is for me where the sweet spot is in banking and where you can revolutionize it. But a black bank and a state bank, The reason why you need to finance the development agenda. So when you want to charter an aircraft to bring in the vaccines and the price is so different to a commercial airline, that's where State Bank can come in and say, I'll take the risk, I'll finance the risk, and that you can look at different debt levels. So disruption, I think our market in South Africa is ready for a disruption. So you don't see the exiting of Black CEOs that we see at the moment, where you say, you know what, I don't want to bank with a bank that's blue, red, green, or blue, or two shades of blue. Let me go to a bank that has a different color, because that bank meets my ideological values and is prepared to finance the people who look like me, and the people like me that have a huge Black family that I have to pay for, who understands my reality. I think there are some great examples around when you do skill transfer, where it's worked in the sectors that I've worked in telecoms and in energy and in broadcasting, when it's done with the right intention and not a whole lot of people photocopying, making coffee and standing alongside the roll, not even picking up the leaves that are meant to be picked up, then I do think we can see a tremendous shift in developing a pipeline of skills. And I think I will leave it there for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Sis Judy. Thank you, Ayabonga. Colleagues, I'm sure you've picked up that our publication and the subsequent post-launch work has raised several pertinent political economy issues in the triple BE, but also the broader Black enterprise debate. So we were supposed to take a 10-minute break, but unfortunately, because we started a bit late and we've been running a bit behind time, I'm going to suggest that we take only a 5-minute comfort break. And when we return, we're actually going to engage with the most exciting part, because now we're going to take all these macro political economy issues.
And we're not being exciting, really. Ayabonga, let's protest.
Really, come on, man. Come on.
And see how they resonate with the experiences of entrepreneurs. And the interesting thing about the entrepreneurs in the next panel is that they speak, all of them, to the debate around global value chains, renewable energy, and we've also got colleagues who work directly in the local states. So let's take a 5-minute comfort break. It is 1:05. Let's take a bit of a comfort break until 10 past. You can blame Ayabong and Judy for cutting your 5 minutes and then return. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Hello? Hello?
I can hear you.
Okay.
I also can hear you.
Colleagues, will start in 1 minute. There's 1 minute left. I already stole 5 minutes, so I thought I'd give everyone the 1 minute, Chris. Thank you, colleagues, for your patience, and also to all those who relayed interesting questions for the discussion that we had in the previous section. We're now going to have our second panel, and as I stated in my introductory comments and before the break, this is the panel where we're going to be dealing more with stakeholder and business persons or business individuals or entrepreneurs' experiences, particularly within the local state. So what I'm going to do for this panel is basically first start by just reading out all the profiles of the panelists, and then I will hand over to the panelists so they can then present for their 15 minutes, and then we'll take a final question and answer session. The first panelist is Eddie Rachabe. Eddie Rachabe is an economist, researcher, and small business activist with over 15 years experience in advisory roles. Eddie has held numerous advisory roles at National Treasury, NRF, the Financial and Fiscal Commission, providing advice on a range of public finance policy issues. He is the founder of Empiricon Advisory, which provides economics research services, business development services, and economic intelligence. Eddie writes for the Mail and Garden, Financial Mail every now and then, and he's a PhD student at the Wits School of Governance. Our second panelist, Mr. Ndumiso Mukako, is a young activist who has experience in both the public and private sector. He started his career in the office of the mayor in Chief Albert Lutuli municipality, went on to be a senior manager in Mpumalanga Public Works, Roads and Transport, a manager at Deloitte Consulting, and is currently the Chief Financial Officer at the Dr. Pixley Kasieme local municipality. And he has also served as a board member of the NYDA. He holds a BCom majoring in finance and internal auditing from the University of Pretoria and an honors in public administration from Stellenbosch University. Usis Andiza Kozwa is a qualified quantity surveyor and candidate professional quantity surveyor with broad technical expertise and has over 10 years experience in the building and civil construction industry, which she gained through her involvement in high-profile commercial infrastructure, power generation, and human settlement projects across South Africa. Andiswa is currently the managing director of Augusta Project Management, which is an emerging Black-owned company that specializes in project management and construction services. We are also joined as part of the panel by Usis Dikaba, who's a mother of 3 and an auntie to many. She has run many businesses across the energy sector from 2012 to date. Part of the projects that she's been involved in include the solar water heating project under the leadership of Eskom and the Department of Department of Energy, sorry. She has also established a lighting factory that was part of the energy efficiency and green building project for the Gauteng Department of Public Works. She was also chairperson of the Eskom Advisory Committee for Green Energy, and she is currently working in the energy sector on various smart metering and lighting lighting projects. So colleagues, you can hear from these brief bios that we have really quite a panel with extensive and rich experience. So we'll start off with a short presentation from Eddie, and then we will move over to Usis Andiswa Goza, and then Ndumiso Mukaka will follow her, and then Usis Prendikaba will close the second panel. Eddie?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, okay, thank you very much, Chrissy. I'm not going to do a presentation. I'll just do a small 5-minute talk, but just raising a few, questions that I think we might want to debate. Now, and I'll start with the macro issues, just as a hanger. Now, the question we really should be asking ourselves, I suppose, is when it relates to BE and public procurement, is whether should it really even be a concern that public procurement should be promoting a BEE, because if you look at the premise of our very own constitution, is drafted from the premise of injustice. And who were those people who were discriminated against? Mainly they are Black people. But then when you look at the Triple PF, and we look at what exactly it seeks to do, it says it wants to advance the economic opportunities for previously disadvantaged communities or individuals. Now, with respect to procurement, the question we should be asking ourselves is, who are these previously disadvantaged individuals? Are we talking about just Prasem who's manufacturing maybe 20 bricks a day? Or are we talking about Jackson who's got a 2,000 a day bricks? Or are we talking about somebody, a much more established entrepreneur who can do 10,000 bricks a day? So those are the questions that we need to be asking ourselves. But the second one, which is even more important, is about the entrepreneurial activity of these previously disadvantaged individuals. If you look at the number of statistics from World Bank, IMF, when they talk about entrepreneurial activity in South Africa, especially in relation to Black, it's very low. And the question is why? And it's because of the structural limitations that I think we've spoken about. And now, when we come and say we want to promote BEE through public procurement, and then we've got all this population group with all these impediments, with all these structural limitations, how then are you going to use public procurement to promote all of this previously disadvantaged group with all their limitations? The third limitation is the industrial sophistication with this population grouping. So in one of the work that we did, looking at the industrial sophistication within the township, we actually found that there is absolutely no sophistications to talk about. Now, the question that you then ask yourself is, when you have at the national or even provincial level with policies such as the township, which targeting the township economy, And yet you find that in the very township that we're talking about, many of the people who are running businesses, they are resellers. They are just simply buying stuff and selling to the immediate consumers. Now, when you talk about a policy that says you're going to be developing townships, and yet the level of industrial sophistication within those very townships is very limited to the extent that it won't respond to your procurement needs. What then are you talking about? So where do you start if you really want to use public procurement to promote triple B or BE, for instance? And this brings me to the second point, is before we can even do that, we need to look at the size of the public procurement budget. Now, we are running a budget which is about 1.8 trillion rand, give or take. But if you strip out the budget that is strictly for procurement, or what it would generally be goods and services budget, we're talking about no more than 300 billion. Now, we're talking for the whole country. We say you are going to catalyze black businesses with only 300 billion rand out of 1.8 trillion. It's one of the questions that we need to be asking ourselves. How big a budget do we really need in order to catalyze triple BEE through public procurement? The second one is the composition of the public procurement, which is very crucial. Now, if you let's take for instance in national government, for instance. Now we've got to be asking ourselves, what is it that national government buys on a regular basis that black entrepreneurs or black businesses produce? Now, at a national level, you can argue that mostly those big national departments will be buying technologies, computers, and all of those things, softwares. And how many black entrepreneurs, how many black-owned enterprises which are actually participating in that space? When you go to provinces, it's even worse. The biggest buys for provinces would be your medical supplies. And mostly we import this technology from the likes of France and Germany. Now, the other limitation is, how then do we expect black entrepreneurs with so much level of industrial sophistication to be responding to procurement requests for proposal from provinces, which would be mainly buying medical supplies or medical equipment, medical technology? Do we have that capabilities to produce such kind of technology? Where do we start if we really want to talk about public procurement? Now, at a local level, what is it that municipalities buy on a regular basis? And to this date, I don't think we really have a database or some kind of information that shows the type of items, the types of equipment that government buys on a regular basis, so that you almost give like a market signal to entrepreneurs. And this is what Ivan was talking about. You've got to be giving entrepreneurs some signal so that they can plan forward. So if they know what provinces are likely to buy, what a municipality is likely to buy on a regular basis, that gives the entrepreneurs to be able to respond in much more adequately. And the last point I think I would like to point out here is around the parceling out that I've spoken about. Is when we think about the way in which the entire of public procurement is highly dispersed, and this is a function of a structure, because you've got one institution here, another institution there, another provinces there. Now, all of this have got these small procurement budgets. How do you consolidate all those procurement, all those budgets, so that at least you get maximum impact when you actually go out and procure stuff from black entrepreneurs? Now, do we say that when, for instance, a municipality in Northwest and another municipality is sitting in the Eastern Cape wants to go and buy gas, or for argument's sake, they want to go and buy bitumen for argument's sake, do they then go into a transversal contract and then actually make sure that they, at least you give whoever the supplier is going to be supplying some bit of the advantage of a scale, rather than only going to buy a few tons of bitumen, and therefore you're not necessarily giving the particular entrepreneur an advantage to grow, because now they have to rely on this small contract. So this is where I think the contradiction I was trying to talk to earlier comes in, is to what extent do we then use transversal contracts as opposed to the parceling out in order to drive and catalyze much more bigger procurement, BE procurement? Do we then go for the sharing economy as the many municipalities would want to do, or do we go for a big bang where you actually want to make sure you promote an enterprise that is most likely likes to be bigger? Lastly, is the issue of the shaming of entrepreneurs, and this goes with the whole with around entrepreneurship. So now, if you look at the Black people who are doing mostly doing businesses with the government, we dub them the entrepreneurs, but we don't give the same kind of titles to the white companies that are doing business with government. The question is why, and this is what brings me to the next example, which is the issue around tender award limitations, which I think is we may want to even think about it very hard. If you go to any office, any government office, it doesn't matter, even if you go to state-owned enterprises, you're most likely to bump into this very popular company, Bidvest. Now, we can argue about whether Bidvest is white-owned or whatever the case may be, but it's got those historical connotations of being white-owned, notwithstanding the fact that the public investment corporation actually owned quite a large chunk of Bidvest. Now, should we be happy with seeing Bidvest being represented in just about every building, or should we be saying that at least some of the contracts, after a certain contract value, after a company having attained a certain contract value, whether by rent or the number of contracts, there should be limitations as to the number of the tenders it can get. And to do that, obviously, you need some kind of an tender information management system, which is flaky. And that's why you would find that some companies are able to get away with multiple tenders without anybody noticing. So going forward, I suppose that if we really are serious about promoting Black businesses through public procurement, is about how do we limit some of these multinational corporations such as your Bidvest, so that they don't necessarily gain monopoly powers through the public procurement system, because obviously you're almost hindering progress by supporting the same company, yet at the same time you are purporting to be supporting small businesses through the public procurement system. So I think for me that would be the key issues. The very last point is about the structural issues that we've spoken about. Is if you look at the vertical nature of the market in South Africa, it really does not give anyone an opportunity to grow. So if, for instance, there is a mega infrastructure project in KZN, for instance, to build multiple flats or multiple social housing. Now, the company which would have won the tender award would obviously want to go and procure from somebody who can keep them space, who can manufacture bricks, who can manufacture windows at scale. They're not going to go for someone who's producing 10 bricks in Umlazi, because that obviously comes with the cost. Now the question is, what do you do? Do we continue to promote? You continue at that very path of supporting the big businesses because we want to be seen to be completing projects in time and within the budget. And as somebody has said, transformation is expensive. Should we not be thinking about something like intermediation, for instance? So if you have 10 brick manufacturers in Umlazi, for instance, should we not, before you can even start your procurement planning processes, go out and see what is available within the very area where you're going to be implementing the project? Obviously, it's going to be costly, but that is the cost of transformation that I think we've got to take if we really are serious about using public procurement to support triple BE. So going forward, I think it's just a matter of intermediation. Who then does intermediation? At what level does legislation allow us to do that level of intermediation? What would the competition policy say if we have to consolidate small suppliers so that they can come together to supply a particular project? Should that be on a once-off basis, or should we, as somebody suggested, should we give them maybe multi-year contracts so that they can support or they can supply multiple projects within a particular region, for instance? So it's almost like you're allocating business to small businesses, but the idea is not necessarily to stifle competition, but the ultimate idea is about transformation. You want to see this business over time thriving or even growing, and therefore stepping out of the public procurement process and starting to supply other businesses within the same region. So that would be my input for this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eddie. I think you're raising some pertinent or important themes that even came out of the book, but also the previous section. The link between, again, long-term LED planning and supporting Black entrepreneurs at the municipal level. Another important theme that I think you're raising for us to consider is the issue of tender caps and checking that we don't award procurement in a way that reproduces the market dominance of certain companies along the value chains. And then the third thing is that, again, not looking at just 30% procurement, but where are people getting those those products? Are they locally manufactured or not? Let's go over to our next presenter, which is Usis Andiswa. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm just trying to join with my video. If you can just give me a second. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope everyone can hear me. Kwezi, can you just confirm that you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, sis.
All right, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the invite, Kwezi. Where can I start? I think I'm very fortunate to have played a role in both the private sector and the public sector. And where I am right now is that I'm on my own on the side of a private sector, and particularly a Black entrepreneur. I think in my experience, both professionally and being a business person, the first thing that I've come to note within the South African context is the fact that the control and the distribution of the economic ownership is not a representation of the population. So what does this mean? This means that if we look at the economic participation of South Africa, and you look at the population, and you look at who is participating more in the economy, doesn't represent the population. So the minority is participating more than the majority. For example, in my industry, particularly in construction, when we look at the representation, we find that there is a representation of 3% of Black women and 10% of Black men. So there's an underrepresentation of Black people overall within the construction industry. When we further look into this as Black entrepreneurs, the challenges that we are facing, particularly as women, is access to the markets, access to funding, access to opportunities, right? So in my time as having worked in private sector as a professional, I've come to discover that there is no real drive for government to create opportunities for Black entrepreneurs. And I will state a few scenarios where we, as a country, we've had major opportunities, particularly in infrastructure, which could have made a huge turnaround for particularly Black-owned businesses. We had the Gautrain coming in, and during the time of the construction of the Gautrain, we had companies coming in from France that came in to provide assistance, that came in, to piggyback on the opportunities that were supposed to be for South Africans. Equally, when you look at the Eskom, Medupi and Kosile, opportunities went to companies that came from Germany. Most of the components were being procured from Germany. We had commissioning engineers that were coming from Germany, which then meant that a huge portion of the profits and the market went to foreign companies. Most Black-owned companies did not have much opportunities. Well, from the perspective where I was working, there was very little interaction with Black-owned companies. There was very little opportunities as well presented for Black-owned companies. Right. Presently, the government has also gone into a new project, which is the Prasa Gibela, which is also a consortium, and within the consortium, we have Alstom leading the consortium. Alstom is a France-based company. So once again, we are seeing opportunities within our country that are being outsourced to international companies. It's now become a trend in South Africa where when the are on the back foot of the economy. The other issue there, the fact that government is not vested in growing Black entrepreneurs, right? And what I mean when I say government is not vested in growing Black entrepreneurs, I mean that the issues of having incubations, of having enterprise development working is not genuine. So in South Africa, we find that where there's an incubation program, most incubation programs are failing. They are failing because the markets are closed. So we can go into training for 2 years, for 3 years, and once those incubators are out of the incubation program, they are not able, and there are not enough programs, the missing link in the market. So if you look at the CIDP registration, you find that there's over 100,000 grade 1 companies. These are entry-level companies that have gone into the market. So you are talking about people who have no experience, whose companies have never traded, who are saying we are looking for opportunities, right? And then you track a few years down the line, how far those companies have grown. You will find that those companies have not grown much because there is not many opportunities in the market for grade 1 companies. How are Black people accessing markets? The other issue that we are encountering, particularly in infrastructure projects, is that there's a dominance of white-owned companies. The government has just released the strategic infrastructure projects, and that alone is worth 360 billion. Right. The issue that I particularly have with the SIPS projects is that there's not much information on how Black companies are going to be benefiting from this. We saw that the Baldwin Properties was just awarded 80 million rands out of this 80 million, and their share price went up. Now, equally within this 80 billion rands, we don't have an understanding as yet as to how this 80 billion rands is going to benefit Black-owned companies. What we do know is that of the 84 billion rands, 30 billion rands is going to be government funding. Now, there's a failure within our own government to fast track the empowerment of Black businesses. The stimulus, I think that during the COVID-19 situation, where we're in a pandemic situation, Minister Kumbuzo, who is the Minister of Small Business, did confess within Parliament that even the COVID-19 relief companies, and the question will then be, where are the Black-owned companies in all of this? I think that one of the issues that we are having in South Africa is that there's an institutional barring of Black companies not to participate in the economy. Government, where we would have said that would have opportunities to participate in the mainstream economy, we are finding that 80% of Black-owned businesses are still operating in the informal sector. Recently, also, there was the issue of Minister Sisulu, who has just announced the fact that we are going to be bringing in engineers from Cuba to come and do most of the water and sanitation projects. I think even this announcement is what is going to hinder the economy for Black businesses, because the people that will be mostly affected by this are Black engineers. This takes away work from Black professional engineers who are running their own consulting firms, who are in the space. We have engaged with EXA to find out whether these engineers who are coming from Cuba will be able to function without any oversight and any mentorship from EXA registered engineers. And it turns out that these Black engineers will have to perform under supervision from EXA registered engineers. So there again comes the issue that Black owned companies are being undermined by our very own government. I think from my side, as a Black women-owned company, the challenges that I've faced mostly is those of access to markets. The government rules and the expectations are very stringent. Okay, so what it means is that as a startup company, as much as a professional, I have the capacity to deliver, but as a company, the track record that we have is still very little. So we might be a group of professionals that have come together, that have got the professional expertise, but the company on its own as an entity does not possess that expertise. And government will have expectations to say, we are looking at what work the company has done versus what work the professionals that are running the company has done. So I think that there's also those issues where we need to look into the procurement to say, are the procurement processes of government pro-Black? And are they pro-Black business? Do they allow Black businesses to compete in the markets? So I think for me, those are the biggest issues that we've encountered, particularly in my industry, that I would like the government to look more into. I feel that the issue of BEE is not sufficiently discussed. I personally feel that it looks good on paper, but I don't think there is a robust implementation of BEE. I hope you've all had me very well, and this is my contribution to this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sis Andy. So I think you're raising very important issues, and they resonate with the findings in our book also around the relationship between the local, state, and Black enterprises, but particularly incubation programs in the local states. The debate that we've had around the link between successful BEE implementation and competition policy, and the fact that competitiveness is a product of market access, and we need to see how we make more use of competition policy to achieve the intended outcomes. The next speaker is Mr. Ndumiso Mkako. He's going to give us a perspective from the local states. Obviously, as alluded to in when I was reading the bio, he has experiences from the private sector with procurement. So Ndumiso, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mabasa. Good afternoon to fellow panelists. Thanks for the invite to come and exchange ideas in this important discussion on Black entrepreneurship and public procurement. I think the question we are trying to respond to here is, at a macro level, can be put as, were we able to use the state's buying power to help resolve the South African problem, or part of the South African problem, which is about the economic marginalization of the majority. And I want to agree with you, Kwezi, with the Black Business Council and the many panelists that spoke before me, that we have not been able to do that. And this our people express in one way or another. And as public policy actors, we experience this thing daily. One of the ways in which our people register their dissatisfaction with South Africa's public procurement system and its inability to open access to the market and empower our people is through these groups, which at times, because they do it through illegal means, we tend not to pay attention to the voices they are raising or the legitimate concerns they are raising. One of them is a group called Amadela Ngokubona. These are people who go around illegally stopping projects, demanding 30%. It does have a very high level of criminal elements. But at the center of the entire thing, they are registering how the system has failed them in general, and in particular, the system of public procurement. Those who follow the news closely will know that there are instances where supply chain committees are disrupted by citizens, whether business forums or Namadela Ngokubona. A recent case was in a municipality in JS Moroka, where an adjudication and evaluation committee was sitting, and a group of people entered with guns. They took laptops, cell phones, and all tender documents which were to be adjudicated over. You would also know that in other parts of the country, people who chair bid adjudication committees, like chief financial officers, move around with protectors or what we call bodyguards because they fear of their lives. Those are some of the experiences which show that the system is suffering from a legitimacy crisis, and the people of South Africa are in one way or another saying it is not fit for purpose. One of the things, there are other challenges which colleagues raised earlier. One of that is how the system has been corrupted. The Black Business Council spoke about the payment of cold drink, that South Africa's public procurement system has been corrupted such that you have to pay from the first person that sells you to the tender document to the last person you submit to, and to others that you must pay a lot of money for. Many of the people in this panel would be conversant with the story former President Mbeki likes sharing of a young IT innovator who wanted to sell an IT solution to a certain municipality in the country. And all the people he spoke to demanded shares. They said, this is what we need. This can be fit for purpose, can help take the country forward. But we want shares in your company before we proceed with you. So that shows the level of corruption in the public procurement system, which contributes greatly to the legitimacy crisis it suffers from. Now we must get beyond that. We must then understand, where is the problem? This is how the people are registering their dissatisfaction. But what is the root cause of the problem? Because we appear to be dealing with symptoms rather than the problem. And I want to argue strongly that the 2020 draft procurement bill dealt mainly with the symptoms and not the systematic problems or the root cause of the problem. And my message is that at the center of the problem is that we failed to strike a balance between the rules game and our socio-economic development objectives or imperatives. So as things stand today, as public policy actors, we are more concerned with compliance, with playing the rules properly, more than achieving what you call socio-economic development imperatives or objectives. And if you want to trace the root of the problem, you will go to where we start defining or speaking about public procurement in a democratic South Africa, which is section 217 of the Constitution, where we speak of 5 important principles which must guide and govern public procurement, which is about equitable, fair, transparent, competitive, and cost-effective. The first mistake we do is to assume that these terms are class neutral: equitable, fair, transparent, competitive, and cost-effective. And because we did not give them the proper class context and the meaning which they are supposed to have, we therefore allowed or carried over this misdefinition of the terms to other things that we did thereafter. Because what is fair to established business, or what is competitive to established business, is not what is established to a new entrant in the market. So what is cost effective to an established business is not what is cost effective to a new entrant. We then went in 1997, we produced a green paper on public procurement. And the discussions of that green paper were led by Treasury and Department of Public Works, and which in my view represents the second problem, because it then closes out the discussion on value chain. If it was to include the discussion on value chain, it had to speak to the Ministry of Trade and Industry of the time. So we lost the foresight of using public procurement or the state buying power to expand, to make sure that we have entrance in the entire value chain or expand our industrial base as a country. We then went to the preferential procurement policy of 2000, followed by the MFMA in 2003, and the 2005 Treasury regulations on supply chain, which is what guides what we do every day today. And if you look at the 2020 bill and the 2005 Treasury regulation, there's still very little that deals with systematic problems, but mainly they deal with the symptoms. How an adjudication committee should be composed, how an adjudication committee, how frequent should it meet, how should it meet, how long an advert must be. But those are not the real thing. The information does get to our people, but the truth is our people do not qualify. The truth is our people do not have access to market, or our people get these things at much more expensive things. So those are some of the things which as actors we have to contend with on a daily basis. And if there is no shift from the approach which prioritizes or makes primary rules over developmental objectives, our people will continue to be extremely unsatisfied with the procurement, with the public procurement system and how it is done. We do majority of our things to comply with what the Auditor General says more than what is required by society. The Auditor General is very important for us to make sure that we have clean governance, because clean governance determines, also helps us aid the legitimacy of the government or our processes. But we must also be flexible such that we are able to respond to developmental imperatives. One of the questions of the burning issue that came out from almost all speakers who spoke about the plight of African entrepreneurs, they spoke about the issue of access to market and expanding our industrial base. And I want to say that the law does make some provisions for that. It's through sessions. But the reality of the matter is that this thing of sessions does not extend our industrial base, nor does it give Africans access to capital. It may give them access to the goods because they do not pay anything. But more worryingly, it keeps money circulating in the same hands. So if you have somebody which we award a tender to build a school for 10 million, for argument's sake, and material to build that is required at 60%, 60% of that 20 million goes to what we call original equipment manufacturers through sessions. And that on its own has reduced the revenue or the turnover, which is likely to go to the African business person. And what does that do? It keeps the money in the same hands. Treasury regulations, and consistent with what is proposed by the 2020 bill, speaks about things of you are not supposed to award a bid to a person who has got his account in errors. And that shows the problems of the system, because small entrepreneurs, majority of them are survivalists. There is a possibility that by the time they compete for a tender or they bid, they still owe this or the other person. Some of them even borrow the money to make sure that they are able to submit a bid, because some tender documents are still sold. So if you are saying, even if he's the best in terms of the proposal, in terms of all the things that you require, just because he owes a municipal account, you are not awarding them. That is one form of exclusion. And this speaks about our failure to balance developmental imperatives or objectives with the rules in the game, and which are very important. We also have an issue which was spoken to, and when they spoke about how the PPC spoke about the requirements and experience. Even Treasury does that a lot. You find that when we speak about experience, we do not consider your experience as a person, but that of the entity. If we are today to look for somebody to do for us any strategy or research work, we will not consider the work Kwezi has done at MISTRA as a team leader of any project, but we'll want reference letters at MISTRA. It means that if Kwezi is to open his own practice tomorrow, he will take almost 5 to 10 years to be an important player in the industry. And that is also an issue of more about the rules than about impact and developmental objectives. The issue of administering a tendering process and the use of technology. The 2020 bill does speak of it, but it is not clear on what really should happen. Let us make an example. In my view, if we are to take this forward, e-tender should be zero rated. Anyone who's looking for tender should be able to access that information, even if they do not have data. That is just one example. The other example which I want to speak to is that even tender documents themselves, they remain extremely complex to fill, such that many entrepreneurs even pay other people to fill them. A friend of mine always says tender document might be more complex than writing a master's thesis. You also have a lot of compliance issues with tender documents. You can bid for 2 tenders closing at the same day. In the one, you remember to fill in a declaration form. In the other, you do an error in the declaration form. And the AG demands that we disqualify you for an incomplete declaration form. And yet it is still the same you. So in tender 10 of 2017, you are compliant, you get the award. In tender 11, which closed the same day, same time, you just did not fill in the form properly. As actors, we are coerced to penalize you, because if we do not do that, we'll have a finding of non-compliance. We also go to the issue of price lists. I had colleagues speaking about price lists and how we should make sure that we benefit from economies of scale. Unfortunately, because Treasury does things in a piecemeal, and many policy actors are struggling to determine a standardized price list. And if you look at the pricing patterns, the PPE is a good example, but many others that came before that, you will realize that the issue of competitiveness and cost effectiveness is not properly adhered to. Many things are still sold far more or bought by the state, far more than what they are charged in the market. And that, what does that do? It takes money intended for service delivery. There are departments of health in the country which would buy a coffee for 200 rands or 300 rands. When you go to an ordinary spa, you get that thing for 60 rand. So those are some of the challenges that we face as policy actors on a daily basis. The last one is the important point made by Eddie, which speaks about economies of scale. And we have made a proposal on a number of occasions when I was still in consulting of a shared supply chain management services, where people in a particular locality or a district municipality can use one service provider done by, maybe procured through the district, to make sure that they have they benefit from economies of scale. What are things which we buy in common on a daily basis? All municipalities will buy water chemicals because they provide water. Why don't we have one service provider who are going to get for all 7 municipalities in Herstebande and make sure that he or she benefits from economies of scale by going to buy for all 7, rather than all 7 municipalities having their own? So those are some of the things which I think we should improve as policy actors together with policy makers, because majority of these things are decided by legislators, and all we do as policy actors is to implement. I think that is my short-lived experience in Kwezi, in not so many words. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ndumiso. It's great to hear all these lived experiences from both the entrepreneurs and yourself as the Chief Financial Officer. I think you're raising important issues again. Policy synergy, the relationship between the triple PFA and BE generally. Important issues around regulatory burdens and red tape. And also, are we following the rules or not? Are we following? How do we follow the rules in a manner that still allows us to attain transformation and economic diversification? Our final speaker is also someone who has extensive experience, especially in the energy sector. And I think this is very important because we've raised the point sharply about the notion of Black enterprise development and new markets, and linking that to energy and industrialization. Brandy, please share your experiences with us.
Good morning, colleagues. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are, sis.
Okay, thank you very much. It's always a difficulty to speak after Undumiso has spoken, because the CFO, for municipality, and my business largely operates in the space of municipalities. So I must watch my steps and not try and mess up. Colleagues, I think my first point of departure would be at firstly addressing the issue around how did we as entrepreneurs move from entrepreneurs to being called tenderpreneurs. That would actually then be the first point in which you realize the depth and the challenge we are facing. The depth of the problem in that the tenderpreneurs, I remember, because luckily I do also circulate in the political space. The tenderpreneur space would come because of a conflict between the then SACP, COSATU, with government. And then the naming that people are tenderpreneurs, they're not businesses, are being supported, then emanates. So you then understand that the level of just thinking about intra-Black people entering a space where for many years and for many centuries, other people have been allowed to trade and never been called names. The procurement on its own, if you look at government, especially the local government space, is a challenge. From a policy perspective, the Municipal Finance Management Act, its limitations to those that must actually conduct this procurement become something that is very, very complex. If you realize, in a number of municipalities, there is never a budget to run a pilot. So basically, just from the start, if you were to think innovatively, if you were to talk to procurement from a perspective that says, let us try this, somebody has got to finance that. And there is no budget to try out systems, to try out technologies, to try. If you don't procure it fully on a tender process, then you are never going to experience it being used. And as such, that is the first problem that we have. I'm glad that Dumiso speaks of the compliance situation that we are faced with, and how then do we say that BEE must actually be enforced in local government spaces. The local government sector has a big belief that theirs is a 30% giving, but they've not even been able to achieve that. As such, groupings that are emanating, and what Dumiso is referring to, is something we've been experiencing. You experience a lot of bullying from local-based suppliers because they believe that they were jumped. They believe that in the favoring system, because there is a notion that whether true or whether it's just people being malicious, there's a notion that all those that have got tenders in a government or in government or in municipal systems got those tenders because they know anybody. Nobody takes into cognizance that you're a professional. Nobody takes into cognizance that you are good at what you do. All that they want to know, Wazibani kamasipala, who do you know in that environment? Which sometimes is very strange and sometimes is very true, because as a person who's operated in the space, you know the frustrations that you go through just to access a meeting, to do a presentation on something the institution requires or needs. You know that they need this technology, you know that they need this service because you've done your research. But for you to access a meeting, it is going to be a very high mountain to climb. How then do we then start to argue for an implementation of a policy that is not? BEE is a policy. However, the question that we must ask is, why is it that there is no monitoring mechanism that is put in place to monitor this performance of this BEE? Why is it that USIS Judy at a national level is still complaining with making market space available for service providers that are Black today? Because this is supposed to be automatic. And it's just unfortunate that we are having this discussion. And it's so sad because we are having this discussion and complaining amongst ourselves. We don't have the Minister of Small Business on the platform. We don't have anybody from Treasury on the platform to be able to actually give us a perspective of their understanding that when they say they have met their quotas, what are these quotas? Because we as people who are interacting with their system every day are very frustrated. I mean, you would know that every other week or every other month, every other time government faces a problem with procurement, they change the system. It is us service providers, or it is us, those who must bid, who must then struggle with MPD forms. Every other day, your MPD form is lapsed, this has lapsed, and all of these systems are not even, nobody takes accountability from a government perspective to say, we are creating this MPD form. You know, to fill a tender, Ndumiso, you're correct when you say people have got to pay a lot of people just to make sure that they get their services out there. You've got to start spending money that you do not have just for you to play in the market. So within the energy space, there is a unique experience that the solar water heating program ran for quite some time. And in that space, there were no Black players. Black players only came in as employees of big manufacturing companies. Some were not even manufacturing. They were bringing cheap geysers from China until we fought and found our way. But at the moment, at the time when we then started saying, let us create space for Black participants in that no manufacturer can also be an installer, the department stopped the program. It's been 5 years. And at the time when the program stopped, it had about 5 or 6 billion rands. It's been 5 years that it stopped simply because Black players in that industry demanded an equality. So we are on our own. We must just be honest with ourselves. We are on our own as Black entrepreneurs. We are on our own because government has no priority level in making sure that we enter that space. And I can tell you that there are many other things that you can use as an example of why do we continuously struggle. We can talk about how the schemes they set up end up again chunking us out because there will be 1 or 2 people who are in charge of them who decide, nope, I don't want. So there is a consistent battle from us as Black business and as Black entrepreneurs with this BEE. BEE is a good policy, by the way. Don't make a mistake. Leave the fact that to an extent, it has been abused. Many people have abused it, where set schemes are placed, people have brought their cousins, and it's just a jamboree. But the policy itself is an important a piece of the puzzle that must exist. And whether should then BEE be reviewed, the first question is, what have we done to monitor? What have we done to punish those that do not want to come to the playing field? We have not done anything. So people know that it's just an exercise of filling papers. I mean, many companies will tell you. There's a company that makes geysers in South Africa. And at the point when we approached it to say, look, we've got the capacity, we know, we wanted to be your Black partners, they laughed at us because they knew nobody was going to punish them out of the industry, of the market, when they don't have a Black partner. So these are real and lived experiences. However, we can then also believe that we can't just sit on the sideline and keep quiet. We've got to continuously engage with them. But in our engagement with them, we need to be realistic about it, that very much has not been done in terms of practicalizing some of the elements in the policy.
Thank you very much, Sisi. Are you done?
I thought I'm actually over my time. I saw you looking at me with that. I still have time.
No, you still have about 3 minutes to wrap up.
Okay, thank you. So in wrapping up, I think what we need to be honest about is to ask government if they are real. You know, I mostly say, unfortunately, those that lead us do not have the love for us. Abastandi. As a result, they do not care what happens to us. You are a small business, you can stay 3 or 4 months not being paid. Nobody's going to be accountable to you as to why you are not paid. You will be left in the hands of people who get their salaries every month, and they don't care what you go through. And the second thing is that as Black people, we are very forgiving. As Black businesses, we are forgiving. You know, you see organized white business take government to court to force it to stop using a policy, and we don't see how government will mobilize us to say, or mobilize ourselves to say we want to defend, or we are going to appear in court to make sure that these counter-revolutionary forces, you just hear Treasury every time and again coming up with new rules, but nobody at Treasury stops to ask, what are the effects of these rules that we are putting in place on making sure that we stifle Black business? We see small business department trying, but even in their efforts, it's very little, very late. We must be honest with government, and we must be honest with those that lead us. But we must also be honest with ourselves in that some of this bad behavior, we aid it as entrepreneurs. It is us that allow people to continuously frisk in our pockets because we are desperate. And that desperation becomes because you at times, I've had businesses that people have actually taken their house and put it under a loan to say in the next 2 months, we will be able to pay you back. And when 2 months comes, they are very frustrated. So they'll do anything just to save the situation. But in all, the argument that we do not have skills is not there. The argument that we don't have capacity is not there. We have skills, we have capacity. If the person who is in charge is willing to hold us by the hand, but also need to challenge the flexibility of our policy. That is a problem. You can't go to a municipality and propose something. You literally go and say, look, I've looked at your debt, I've analyzed it. I believe we need to do the following things. They just can't agree to utilize your service before they take it out on a tender. And in the process of taking it out on a tender, your whole IP, your whole idea is exposed to very unscrupulous people. You find yourself competing with Chinese on something that they've never known or they didn't know. So those are challenges that we face. However, we are strong. We are not also going to throw in the towel and the bathwater. And yes, indeed, Sis Judy, the T is the problem in this tenderpreneurship thing, because we are never tenderpreneurs, we're entrepreneurs. And it's a lie to say that Black business has cost much. When the airport was cleaned before Black people came into the cleaning, if you check at the budget to clean the airport and you check at the budget to clean the airport when Black people started getting tenders to clean the airport grew, the budget went down, but the service was still expected to be the same. So it is our money, by the way, also. We pay taxes, we are part of this country, we work hard. So if there's no money that is going to be spent, because every time Black people are involved, we're told that it's expensive, who must then take the risk on us? Must we then go to go China or go to go where they are going to take the decision to support us? I can never agree to this thing or understand it, that procuring our services is always expensive because we're required to be assisted. So it's part and parcel of the challenges that we face. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sisi, for the insightful comments. It's always great to hear, lived experiences, especially from entrepreneurs, because I think it's one thing to research the literature and go through the data statistically, but it's always great to hear lived experiences. So colleagues, because of time constraints, we're going to have one round. So I'll just read out some questions from the group, not read out, but summarize them. and then I'll allocate them to the various speakers. And then anyone else who has a question while I'm allocating the questions that have been articulated in the chat can just indicate in the chat that I want to ask a question. The first question has to do with policy synergy. And I think maybe Ndumiso, as a local government official, you can take this one. One of the participants is saying that we have the correct policies, but the problem is the synergy and the planning, especially with regards to BE, but also broader local economic development policy planning. And they even cite some examples there, the MTF and so forth, and other LED strategies. So what in your view can we do, Ndumiso, to address this issue of policy synergy and coordination? We also raised it in our submission to Treasury that you can't read the triple PFA without considering other policies within the economic cluster. And then I think to Usis Prendi, and your experiences around, again, the renewable energy programs, and you alluded to some clear examples. So I heard a lot about what didn't work. It would be interesting to hear what worked in the solar water heating program and any other localized energy interventions, so that at least we can pick up some of those lessons. That would be great. And then I think to Andiswa, there's a question here posed about what are Black entrepreneurs, what value are Black SMMEs adding beyond just the question of historical redress and the constitutional imperatives. So it'd be great to hear your ideas around that. And then maybe Eddie, you could allude to some of the issues around competition policy and what needs to be done to make competition policy more conducive for successful implementation of Black economic empowerment. And maybe let's not focus a lot on just the interventions for the large empowerment transactions that we read about in the newspapers, but what do we need to do from a competition policy perspective to alleviate some of the challenges that are affected by Black-owned SMMEs? Can we just address those questions and maybe take them in a different order this time? Start with Usis Prendi, then Andisa, and then we'll end off with the two gentlemen.
Hi.
Yeah.
Indeed, if we were to be very honest, we did not have the best experience with the solar water heating program, and hence it had to stop. We just being honest about it, it had to stop. We had to stop and say, how do we do this thing better? It worked. We learned a lot of lessons out of it, but we did not get the best experience. And I'm saying this from ROI, return on investment from government. I doubt that we got what we had expected. But what will work? I mean, we've got examples of energy projects that have worked well. Gauteng Provincial Government and Public Works ran the green building exercise on their lighting, retrofitting lighting. That program worked. And part of the people that were brought on board was Masmart from a process of them. However, our experiences are that whilst things work, they get messed up because of the involvement of various individuals within government itself. You can find a good program that works well. There will always be one Dumiso there who's sitting and watching you guys. As you start getting excited by the program, they will stop it. So we're not really sure what would be a perfect system, which I doubt that there is a perfect system, but our system must strive to make sure that Black people, Black participants, Black entrepreneurs in their majority just begin to give service that is good and get paid value for their money and their effort. Andiswa speaks about the big construction projects that are going on in the country and the fact that Black business is still in the dark. Yet we hear that this is procured, that is being procured. And nobody's taking us into thinking on it. So there are many projects that work, comrades. It's not that everything is doom and doom. But with everything that works, one of the things that we must also say, whilst government has got good, very good, professional, learned project managers, it lacks on people who've got industry specialization. So if you speak smart metering, and you must go and speak that smart metering in a municipality, chances are that you are going to deal with an electrical engineer, but that person has got no proper understanding of smart metering. So you as a service provider, now then rely on your relationship with that person more than the fact that does this technology work and service what we need to do, you know? So I'm not going to sit here and lie and say, this is a perfect system. No. We are still, all of us, trying to find each other in the middle, especially when it comes to procurement of these specialized services that we have.
Thanks, Sisandiswa. Is she still with us?
Oh, sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can hear.
My apologies, I had not unmuted my mic. With regards to the question posed, Kwezi, about the value that Black entrepreneurs bring, I think we need to look at why, firstly, Black people go into business. And what drives us to say, we need to open up our own companies and be our own bosses. It's not the issue of one day you wake up and you want to be a entrepreneur. It also boils down to the fact that you want to be an employer, you want to create employment opportunities. Okay. So a very good example is that in my company, Kwezi, is that I employ mostly women. If you come into my office, the engineers are women, the administrators are women, majority of our staff are women more than they are men, and this has been done deliberately. The reason why we are very vested in the employment of women is because there's a lot of young Black women that are unemployed. And if as young Black women with the experience, with the capacity, cannot open up the opportunities for others to come into the markets and become employed, then it serves no purpose, and therefore it would mean that Black businesses bring no value. I think the core and the main reason we want to become entrepreneurs is because we want to change our local communities. You want to bring changes to the local communities. The second issue we want to do as Black entrepreneurs is that we want to close the racial wealth gap. Because I think, as we know, in South Africa, we live in a country where there is racial wealth gap, right? So white people who are in the minority are making more money, are actually wealthier and control more of the economy than the Black people who are in the majority. So in order for us to close those gaps is saying Black people need to ascend to being business owners, and equally you need to open the door for graduates in your sector. You need to train people. So there's a lot of value that we need to add in your own space, in your particular industry. It doesn't just boil down to the fact that Andiswa is a Black woman, and by virtue of a Black woman, I expect somebody to give me an opportunity. No, it doesn't work like that. It's about the fact that Andiswa has, over the years, gained her experience. She knows what she's talking about. She's an industry specialist in whatever she does, and she's able to bring value for money to her client. But also in doing that, she's also opening up other opportunities for other Black women within the industry. Hence, it's important to say, why not partner? Why not JV with other Black companies in order for us to grow? So obviously, as a business, you need to understand what is your value add. What do you have to offer to your clients more than anything else? Blackness is not a product that we sell. I don't sit in my office from 8 to 5 and reach out to my clients and say, I'm selling being a Black woman, and that's the value that I bring to your project. No, I've got a product that is packaged that I offer to clients. And it so happens to be that the product that I offer is being offered by a Black woman, right? And the value that I bring is that I have an entire professional team that is constituted of Black women and Black professional women at that. So it is not just a matter of we want handouts as Black entrepreneurs. It's a matter of we want to bring the changes to our own communities first and foremost. I think that as you know, Kwezi, that as Black kids, when we go to university, we don't even have the funds to pay for our fees. Most of us had to use the NSFAS bursary scheme to get through university. And you can imagine that most of the young Black graduates are the same graduates that are sitting at home being unemployed. So we need to look at what value the Black entrepreneurs bring. Is the value of employment first and foremost, the value of growing communities secondly, and the fact that we are closing the wealth gap within the economy.
Thank you very much, Sis Aniswa. Eddie and then Dumiso. Eddie? Okay. Let's start with Ndumiso. We'll come back to Eddie. Ndu?
Okay.
Oh, thank you very much, Kwezi. I think the question on policy coordination speaks to planning and coordination in the state in general. So it's not only about public procurement policies, there is generally a problem of proper planning and coordination in the state. And we see this in many policy interventions or facets of the state. A classic example, which we always discuss, is our failure to balance our program of industrializing our economy, considering that we do not have advanced technology, and us being signatories of the Paris Agreement, that naturally industrialized economies are those who emit high levels of gas in higher quantity. So I'm just making this one example. So I do think that we need to improve on that. But secondly, something which Prof. Somadoda Figeni says is about the quality of our legislators, those who have charged with drafting and passing laws for us, and ultimately the quality of some of those who lead the state at a policy level. There are challenges, and you see them in things like this, like coordination. So I think it's a holistic issue, but there are other issues like corruption, which the question speaks about, which are really discouraging, and public servants who want to do as little work as possible and steal as much as possible. That is a serious challenge which we need to confront openly and honestly without any fear or favor. So that for me remains a problem as an actor. And it's an issue of consequence management, which the AG raises from time to time, that there aren't proper consequence management in the state for public servants. And we need to get that right. But lastly, I want to conclude by commenting on a very important point made about how entrepreneurs and their ideas are frustrated, and an example of smart meters is made. So unfortunately, because business is not organized like the state, it is difficult for other business people to punish the few rotten apples. Because I want to put it on record that there are many municipalities which have tried doing some smart metering or some form of what we call revenue enhancement. And they get into serious debt because they contract with people who come with brilliant ideas, exploiting the incapacity or the capacity limitations of the state, and ultimately robbing the state. So you find the municipality has got a contract of smart meters, but instead of seeing any revenue improvement, it gets into debt worse. So I'm just saying business must also help us as actors. When they act with the state, they must act as faithful as possible and as true patriots. I know ideologically it might be difficult because business is loyal to profit and only profit, but they must also try to be patriots and serve the country. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ndu, for that comment on developing what the former president would call a patriotic bourgeoisie. Eddie, are you there before I close off?
Yeah, I'm here.
All right.
Sure. For me, I think this whole issue of these challenges cannot be really resolved through the competition policy only. It's really a matter of interface between competition policy and the procurement policy regime. So on the one hand, you need to have the competition policy being very, very strong and very restrictive on anti-competitive behavior, especially abuse of dominant position by some of these big firms, where you find that when a tender is out, a big firm will go out and actually procure every supply in the country so that every small supplier will not find anything. And that obviously is an abuse of dominant position. Now, the question is, how do we then find information when such anti-competitive behavior are actually being conducted by these big firms, and so that they're actually being heavily penalized, not only through the competition policy, but through the procurement policies themselves. So you actually discredit people from the tender process just because they violated the competition policy. You don't just leave these violations to Competition Commission to deal with only. So that's why I think we need that interface between competition policy and the procurement policy. But secondly, is what is actually would be more important is also to exempt some small companies, maybe by the size of the turnover or something, from the competition policy, so that we can allow certain companies to collude. If it means they must go into a certain tender and they don't have the necessary capacity, allow these companies to collude or to go into a consortium, and therefore give them work on the basis of being part of a consortium. So that's I think how I see we're going to resolve this challenge, at least in two parts, not just through the competition policy, but also through the procurement policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eddie. Colleagues, we're going to move over now to the last 5 minutes of the session, where I just briefly summarize what I think are the main points from the discussion and the way forward. The first is to say, I think first, before I go there, let me just start by just thanking firstly all the panelists, thanking the MISTRA team that helped organize this, and also the broader members of the MISTRA family who are here either from the state, from government, or from unions and civil society, who always support our work. We really appreciate your presence and your patience. I'm sure everyone saw the value of having the two sessions of the macro debates, and then integrating them or questioning them with the lived experience of the various entrepreneurs and the local government officials. In terms of the substantive summary, I mean, we all agree that we need to link debates around Black enterprise, BEE, to the structural political economy questions. I think also we need to improve our systems of governance, especially looking at monitoring and evaluation. But also we have to try new things. And what's good from this discussion, and also what's coming from the book and the lived experiences of the entrepreneurs, is that there are various proposals on trying new methods, new forms of policy interventions. And lastly, an emphasis on innovation, new markets, and also removing structural barriers. We will share all the material, which includes the presentation, with everyone. The material would include the MISTRA policy brief, the various op-eds that have been written by the authors, including myself and Ayabonga on the topic, and others, and also some of the digital material, the interviews and so forth. And then we will definitely keep the database, because this is ongoing work. There are varied areas that we want to explore. This was just the first one. And some of them are quite interesting, particularly if one looks at things like ESOPs, but also in worker control. But secondly, also this debate around platinum group metals, BEE, and renewable energy. So we'll definitely be in touch with colleagues about the next steps forward, but I'd like to thank everyone. And again, we extend our gratitude for the patience, and we hope that you enjoyed the evidence-based and the lived experience that came through strongly in this particular webinar. So with that said, I'd like to propose closure, and thank you again, colleagues, comrades. See you next time when MISTRA convenes a dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
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 Thanks, colleagues.
Leave the meeting.
Okay, colleagues, I'm going to end the meeting for all. Thank you.
All right, sure. Thanks, SS.